The prairie wind carried secrets that no man could own. It bent the tall grass in slow waves, whispering across the wide Dakota plains where the horizon met eternity. In those amber fields rode Zane Callahan, 30, a man carved from solitude and sun. His fortune was vast, his ranch endless, yet his eyes, cold as the dying dusk, held the kind of loneliness that wealth could never ransom. He was a man of the West, handsome and proud, built from dust and silence. When Leotai Redbird, 20, arrived at the Callahan Ranch, she did not speak much. Her name meant flower of the prairie, though her steps were lighter than petals. She came seeking work after her village's crops failed, carrying with her little more than a shawl and a quiet strength. The men at the ranch stared, unkind and curious, whispering when she passed. But Zane simply said, "You'll keep the house." Nothing more. His tone was like a gate closing. And though his words cut, Leotai only bowed her head and murmured, "Yes, sir." The wind stirred between them as if it too wished to answer. Each morning she swept the veranda clean, her hair catching the light like a ribbon of ink against the pale dawn. Zane would watch her from the porch, boots resting on the rail, pretending not to. There was something uncomfortably human about her gentleness, an honesty that unsettled him. He had hired her as a servant, but her presence made the house feel alive again, and that scared him more than loneliness ever had. In town, the whispers grew crueler. "The rich cowboy's taken himself a tribal girl," said Mary Lou, whose gossip always smelled of whiskey and regret. When the words reached Leotai, she said nothing. She simply went about her chores, her hum soft and steady, a melody too pure for bitterness. That night, the moon hung low and bruised. Zane caught himself listening for that hum in the stillness, and when he found it, his chest tightened. He wondered, just for a heartbeat, what sorrow she was hiding beneath that calm. Then came the storm. It rolled across the plains like a beast, devouring the horizon. Zane had been out mending a broken fence when the sky split open with dust and rain. By the time he reached home, the world had turned to chaos. Leotai met him at the door, her shawl torn, her cheeks streaked with mud. Without a word, she took his soaked coat, guided him to the fire, and handed him a tin cup of water. For a moment their eyes met, hers wide with concern, his clouded with something he didn't want to name. "Thank you," he said at last, rough-voiced, as though the word was foreign to him. She nodded once, her hand trembling before she drew it back. That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind howled, and each gust sounded like her voice calling from the edge of his dreams. He rose before dawn and saw her asleep by the dying fire, hair loose, a soft exhaustion on her face. The sight twisted something inside him, something he thought he'd buried years ago. He turned away quickly, ashamed of the warmth in his chest. Days passed, and the air between them thickened with unsaid things. Then one morning, Zane didn't come down for breakfast. Hours later, Leotai found him collapsed in his room, burning with fever. She sent for the doctor, but the rains had washed out the road. Alone, she stayed by his bedside, wringing out cool cloths and whispering old prayers in Lakota. He tossed and turned, lost in nightmares, gunfire, smoke, the smell of blood. She held his hand when he cried out, her tears falling onto his skin like mercy. "Please," she whispered to the fevered man, "don't leave this world angry." Through the long night she watched over him, her body trembling with exhaustion. Every breath he took felt borrowed, every sigh a plea she couldn't ignore. At dawn, his fever broke. His eyes opened slowly, meeting hers. Her cheeks were damp, her lips trembling with relief. For the first time, he saw not the servant, but the woman who had fought sleep and sorrow to keep him alive. "Why do you cry for me?" His voice was raw, uncertain. "Because I could not bear to see you suffer," she said softly, almost ashamed of her honesty. Something inside Zane gave way. His hand reached for hers, weak but deliberate. Her palm was rough from work, her skin warm. In that fragile silence, the world felt painfully real. The wind outside grew gentle, brushing the window like a sigh of approval. Yet even as her tears dried, he knew the moment could not last. A man like him had built his life on distance, and he feared what kindness might undo. When strength returned to his body, pride returned with it. One afternoon, as she tended the fire, he spoke the words that would wound them both. "You're my servant, Leotai," he said quietly, staring at the flames. "That's all you'll ever be." The stillness that followed was unbearable. She didn't argue, didn't cry. She simply stood, her face unreadable, and whispered, "Yes, Mr. Callahan." That night, he heard her soft footsteps leaving the house. From the porch, hidden by shadow, he watched her walk toward the edge of the prairie. Under the moonlight, she began to sing, a song her mother had once sung to the stars. Her voice broke halfway through, fragile as glass. He wanted to call out, to beg forgiveness, but shame held him still. By morning, she was gone. The days that followed stretched into a quiet misery. The ranch, once filled with sound, now felt hollow. Zane moved through it like a ghost, haunted by the echo of her song. Even the horses seemed restless, as though they too mourned her absence. In town, he overheard that she'd gone north, trading herbs for medicine among travelers. He considered following her but didn't. Pride still chained his heart, though each day the links grew weaker. Then, one spring morning, she returned. The wind carried her scent before he saw her, sage and rain. She came in a small wagon, its bed filled with herbs and root. Her hair was longer, her face sun-kissed but calm. Zane stepped down from the porch, his hat in hand, the words he'd rehearsed trembling on his lips. "Leotai," he said, voice roughened by regret. "I was wrong." She looked at him for a long time, her dark eyes unreadable. "The prairie forgives only those who listen," she said at last. He nodded slowly, understanding that forgiveness was not his to demand but to earn. They stood there in silence, the wind swirling between them like something alive. Weeks passed, and the ranch began to change. Leotai returned to her duties, though not as before. Now she spoke more freely, laughed at old Ezra's jokes, and even taught the ranch hands songs from her people. Zane watched quietly, his affection growing not from desire but respect. He began to help her with chores, simple things like feeding the horses or fixing the porch railing. Each act, small and clumsy, was his way of saying "I see you." It was old Ezra who first noticed. "Never thought I'd live to see Zane Callahan smile again." He chuckled one evening, polishing his saddle. Zane said nothing, but the corners of his mouth betrayed him. When summer came, the prairie bloomed wild and thick. The wedding was Leoty's idea, though Zane barely dared to hope she'd say yes when he asked. It was a simple affair, no lace, no grand church, just a circle of friends and open sky. Cowboys and tribesfolk stood side by side, the past forgotten in the sound of laughter. Old Ezra presided, his voice trembling with emotion. Zane stood tall in a clean white shirt, his eyes softer than anyone had seen. Leotai wore a dress the color of dawn, her shawl stitched with tiny redbirds. When she took his hand, the world seemed to hush. "I once thought love was something you owned," he said, voice steady but thick with feeling. "But you taught me it's something you give." The wind swept through the tall grass as they kissed, wild applause from the earth itself. Even the sky seemed to lean closer. There was no grand music, no fireworks, just the steady hum of the prairie and the quiet certainty that they had finally come home. Years later, long after the ranch grew gray with age, old Ezra would sit by the fire and tell travelers their story. He'd say that sometimes, if you listen close at dusk, you can hear Leoty's laughter in the wind or Zane's voice calling her name. The prairie, he'd whisper, remembers love the way it remembers rain, slow, patient, eternal. And maybe that's all any of us are meant to do, to love quietly, to forgive slowly, and to listen when the wind begins to speak. Because somewhere out on those golden plains, beneath the endless sky, their story still moves like grass in the breeze, soft, unbroken, and alive.